My name is Aubrey Lowell, and 3 weeks ago, my parents sent a single line that said, I shouldn't come to their anniversary because the guest list was strictly high society. Yet as I stared at that message on my cracked phone screen, I was holding an envelope informing me I'd been nominated for the highest distinction in structural restoration engineering. Madeline called less than an hour later. Her voice coated in the kind of sweetness she saves for moments when she wants something. And she said I should sit this one out because appearances mattered more than confusion about my work. A sentence she tried to lighten with a laugh that landed flat, even through the static. I let her talk because she never asks how I am. Only whether I'll cooperate. And when I finally said I'd received their message, she exhaled like I'd solved a problem she didn't want to admit she created. I told her I was busy that night. And she said she knew I'd understand because the guests were people who expect a certain presentation. A phrase she repeated as if reading from a script she and my mother wrote together long before this call. When she added that she hoped I wouldn't make this complicated, I heard the same tone she used years ago when she told a designer that I avoid big events even though I'd never said that in my life. I ended the call with a quiet goodbye. And she didn't notice the silence stretching under her own words because she was already moving on to whatever part of the evening required her perfect reflection. An hour later, my mother texted a reminder copied straight from the family group chat. Don't come. Honey, it's better this way, and I understood. She'd added me back to that thread only so she could remove me again once her message landed. My father followed with a brief note claiming it was nothing personal. Yet he wrote it the same way he signs off on decisions at his firm. A clipped dismissal disguised as civility. I set their messages beside the nomination letter on my kitchen counter. And while they didn't know it yet, the truth waiting inside that envelope would walk into their celebration long before they ever expected to see me. My mother called the next morning with a tone wrapped so tightly I could feel it through the line. And she said she hoped I wasn't misinterpreting anything because the decision about the anniversary was purely practical. A claim she followed with the explanation that my work was too industrial for guests who preferred conversations about travel and philanthropy. I told her I understood. And she replied that understanding was all she'd ever wanted from me before adding that it would spare everyone discomfort if I simply spent the evening at home. When she hung up without asking how I'd been, I stared at my phone and realized she'd never once bothered to ask that in the first place. My father reached out later with the same clipped politeness he uses in boardroom calls. And he said, Aubrey, these events rely on cohesion, as if my presence were a structural flaw he needed to fix. I told him I hadn't planned on causing problems. And he said, good. Because the guest list was set, and he didn't want anyone asking questions he couldn't answer. He ended the call with a firm, I'm glad we're aligned. And I recognized the way he spoke to me as the same voice he used on quarterly reports he never intended to revisit. Madeline followed in the afternoon. Her words light but strained as she insisted she'd tried to advocate for me until it became clear that the vibe of the night just wouldn't fit. Then she said I knew how Mom worried about impressions, especially when people from her design circles were involved. I told her I didn't want to inconvenience anyone, and she rushed to agree, adding that she was relieved I wasn't taking it personally because the last thing she needed was tension when she was already juggling seating charts. When she laughed softly and said, You get it. Right, I answered, yes. Even though she never paused long enough to hear what I might have said if I hadn't. The letter from the National Heritage Engineering Council arrived the day after those calls. And when I opened it, I saw my name printed above the nomination for the Distinction Medal, a recognition reserved for engineers whose projects had reshaped preservation standards. I whispered, I can't believe this. And the sound felt strange in my own kitchen because no one in my family had ever asked what I'd been working on long enough to know something like this was even possible. I set the letter beside my coffee and let the weight of it settle, knowing it recorded 18 months of work they'd dismissed without ever seeing. Dr. Helena Grant called that afternoon with the warmth of someone who never needed me to justify my choices. And she said she'd reviewed the final evaluation packet and wanted me to hear her congratulations directly before the announcement went wide. I told her the timing felt surreal. And she said, "Surreal or not, you earned it," before mentioning that she'd be attending my parents' celebration because Deborah had invited several design leaders without realizing she'd contacted the director responsible for my nomination. I stood there listening to her describe the guest list my family valued so much, realizing they'd welcomed the one person who knew exactly how much of that nomination belonged to the hours I'd spent alone restoring metal that should have collapsed years ago. She asked whether I planned to attend the event, and I said I hadn't been invited, before she paused long enough to say that the conservatory's restoration had already sparked interest from 3 national outlets, and that she expected questions about the lead engineer's identity. I told her they wouldn't want those questions answered. And she replied, "That choice isn't theirs anymore," with a steadiness that made the room feel smaller. When we ended the call, the house went quiet again, and I realized the truth of my work was already moving toward that celebration, even if I wasn't. Madeline posted a video the next morning from the Ridgeview Conservatory, and as her voice floated through the audio, bragging that the venue looked effortless and polished, the camera panned across the steel ribs. I'd reinforced one weld at a time. She said, "Mom knew this place was perfect the second she saw it," never noticing the identification tag still affixed to one of the support plates in the background. A tag stamped with the project code I'd signed off on. I watched the clip twice without sound, knowing she had walked through 18 months of my work without recognizing a single thing she filmed. My mother called a few hours later, breathless with excitement, as she explained that the conservatory gave the night a level of sophistication you can't manufacture. Then she said she hoped the staff would keep everything pristine because the structure looked delicate in places. I told her the building could handle far more than she assumed, and she replied, "Let's hope so, dear. The last thing we need is a surprise." Unaware she was echoing the exact concern the city's inspection team expressed before approving the final glass load, I recalibrated myself. She ended the call with a cheerful note about lighting placements, and I realized she'd chosen the one venue tied to the work she refused to acknowledge. When Dr. Helena Grant sent me a message confirming her attendance, she added that reporters had been asking whether the lead engineer would appear given the conservatory's restoration had become a reference case for adaptive structural reinforcement. I answered that my family had made their preferences clear, and she responded, "Your absence doesn't change what you built," letting the words sit long enough for me to feel the truth in them. I put my phone down and understood that while they prepared to celebrate inside that glass and steel frame, every surface around them carried the imprint of someone they'd tried to leave outside. Dr. Helena Grant called again on the afternoon of the celebration, and she said the press release announcing my nomination would be published within the hour, followed by a brief statement she planned to give at the conservatory, since several reporters had already confirmed they would attend. I told her I wasn't on the guest list, and she answered, "That has nothing to do with whether you belong in the room," leaving a silence between us that felt heavier than the steel beams I once lifted into place. When I finally said I didn't want to create a scene, she replied, "You won't be creating anything, Aubrey. You'll just be standing inside a structure you kept from collapsing." And the steady certainty in her voice stayed with me long after we ended the call. I sat on my couch with the nomination letter across my lap, and as I traced the embossing on the page, I remembered the night I recalibrated the central load frame after the inspection team flagged a stress variance that would have shut the entire project down. I said out loud, "You saved that place." And hearing the words spoken back to me made the decision I'd been circling feel less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement I'd avoided. I stood and pulled the dress I kept for professional ceremonies from my closet, and the quiet that followed felt different, as if the room itself was waiting for me to move. When I locked my front door and walked toward my car, my phone buzzed with another message from Dr. Grant that read, If you change your mind, I'll be near the east entrance. And the simplicity of it steadied whatever doubt I had left. I whispered, I'm coming, even though no one was there to hear it. And the words settled into something firm enough to carry me through every mile toward the conservatory. By the time the building's glass silhouette rose against the evening sky, I knew I hadn't chosen the moment at all. It had unfolded the second they decided to celebrate inside the walls I rebuilt. I stepped through the east entrance and felt conversations dim as faces turned toward me. And someone near the registration table murmured, "Is that the engineer they mentioned in the release?" while another whispered my name as if testing whether it belonged in this room. My mother's smile faltered when she saw me. And she said, "Aubrey, you shouldn't be here. We agreed this wasn't the right setting for you." But her voice thinned when Dr. Helena Grant approached behind me with the nomination letter in her hand. My father tried to regain control by saying, "This is a private family event, and we don't want confusion tonight." But confusion was already spreading as guests glanced between the letter, the glass frame above them, and the daughter they'd been told didn't fit the evening. Dr. Grant stepped closer and greeted my parents with a calm they couldn't mirror. And she said, "Since we're all here, it's appropriate to acknowledge that your daughter led the conservatory's restoration and that her work is the reason this structure can host an event of this scale." Letting her eyes settle briefly on the central arch she'd inspected months earlier, my mother said, "That can't be accurate. We were told she was only assisting." And Dr. Grant lifted the folder to show the signed engineering reports before replying. "Every major load assessment, recalibration, and reinforcement you see tonight was overseen by Aubrey Lowell." My father swallowed hard, then said, "Why wouldn't she tell us something like this?" And I answered that there hadn't been space for the truth when they'd already decided the version of me they preferred. A cluster of design guests moved closer, and one of them said, "We just read the announcement. Are you the lead engineer the council is honoring?" While my mother tried to deflect by insisting it was all being exaggerated online. Madeline approached with her phone still in her hand. And she said, "You could have warned us, Aubrey. This is humiliating." But her voice shook when a friend beside her asked why she'd spent weeks saying I was unemployed. Cole looked at her with a disbelief he didn't bother to hide. And he said, "You told me your sister didn't do real engineering. So what exactly have you been trying to protect here?" And Madeline offered no answer because none of her lines worked in a room full of evidence. My mother stepped forward as if she could still rewrite the moment. And she said, "Sweetheart, we didn't mean to exclude you. We just thought you'd be uncomfortable." But her words caught when reporters began asking Dr. Grant about the restoration's challenges. I said, "I wasn't uncomfortable with the work, only with the assumption that I didn't belong beside it." And the stillness that followed stretched long enough for more guests to gather beneath the vaulted glass panels. My father tried one final attempt at composure by saying, "Let's not make a spectacle of this." And I told him, "You made the spectacle when you chose this building and erased the person who held it together." Dr. Grant raised her voice only enough to reach the journalists waiting near the stage. And she said, "Tonight's announcement is simple. The conservatory stands because of precise, relentless engineering, and that recognition belongs to Aubrey." Then she placed the nomination letter in my hand as the room shifted its attention toward me instead of the celebration my parents had constructed. My mother whispered, "Please don't do this to us." But I answered, "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm standing in the place you chose without knowing whose hands rebuilt it." And the honesty of it left her with nothing to reply. When guests began offering congratulations and asking about the restoration process, I let their questions pull me forward, understanding that the moment they'd tried to keep me from had already become the one thing they could no longer control. My mother reached for me once the room began drifting back into its own conversations, her voice low as she asked if we could step outside together because there were things she wanted to smooth over. but her eyes kept darting toward guests who had already heard more than she intended. I told her there was nothing left to straighten, and the words stalled in her throat while she searched the glass panels overhead, as if hoping they could offer a version of the evening that hadn't slipped out of her control. My father hovered behind her with the stiff posture he used whenever he wanted to appear composed, urging us to regroup as a family. Though the meaning of that phrase had thinned long before tonight, Madeline approached with her mascara softened at the edges, insisting I shouldn't have walked in the way I did because none of them were prepared. Her fingers tightening around her phone the way people grip something fragile when the truth presses too close. I reminded her the truth had already been in the room long before I arrived, and her breath caught when she realized the earlier video she posted still showed her beaming beneath the steel plates I'd spent months restoring. Cole stood beside her with a look that needed no explanation, asking why honesty had been the only thing missing when it should have been the easiest part of all of this. My father tried once more to gather the pieces by mentioning how unusual it was for them to be confronted in front of their peers. But his voice shifted when he acknowledged he hadn't understood how much of the conservatory depended on my work until tonight forced the knowledge into the open. I answered plainly that he had never asked, and a quiet recognition passed between us as he absorbed the truth without attempting to reshape it. My mother's voice softened enough for her to wonder whether I was already planning to leave, and I told her I was, because staying would only press the bruise they'd pretended wasn't there. I walked toward the exit beneath the arch I had recalibrated more times than I could count, the conversations dissolving behind me as the glass above caught my reflection with a calm I hadn't felt in years. My phone lit up with a message from my father asking to see my next project whenever I was ready. The first time those words had ever been directed my way, I stepped outside and let the cooler air settle across my shoulders. Knowing the line I drew tonight wasn't distance, it was room to breathe. Finally shaped by my own hands. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Because sharing it out loud felt like finally setting something down I'd carried for too long. If any part of my journey mirrors a corner of your own, I hope you hold on to whatever piece you're building next. Before you go, let me know you're here by tapping the heart and leaving a few words in the comments.